Oh boy. Okay, this is what we're going to do. I have to make a confession here of sorts. This is not the only group I'm going to be giving this presentation to. I'm going to be giving this to several groups during the summer, but this is the first one. So this is kind of a tryout here. So far, not going so well, but there's a couple of other. All right, I'm going to skip over a lot of things because we don't have enough time, but we all know the facts and figures, and there were 5 burglars, and there was a lookout across the street at the Howard Johnson restaurant, hotel rather. This was the 3rd break-in. They broke in once before and put in some bugging devices. Same group, same 5. They came back a second time because the bugging devices weren't working. They wanted to put in more, but they couldn't get in the second time. So they really didn't break in. They tried to break in a second time. The 3rd time was the charm. They came back to fix the bugs that the bugging devices they'd already put in, and to put in more and rummage around. And they were surprised that it was so easy to get in. They said, let's keep doing this. Okay. And there's some questions that still remain about why they did it. The most obvious reason for why the break-in occurred is to get some dirt on the Democratic Party. Look and see what they got, and opposition research is what they call it today, to dig up dirt on the Democrats. That was one motivation, probably was the single most significant motivation. A second theoretical motivation was to search for information that the Democrats had about strategies and how they were going to campaign that year. This was an election year, so it was kind of a defensive. We want to see what they've got, what their campaign looks like. And the third suggestion is that they were looking for lists that the Democrats had of prostitutes and johns and things that they had in their possession that might be used against them, kind of dirty laundry stuff. And it's kind of, there are so many court proceedings, of course, in Watergate and trials, and to this day, no one has ever really said this was the reason we did it. There's these 3 reasons have been suggested and others. So, and it kind of makes up, you can make up your own reason. But unquestionably, they were trying to subvert the Democratic National Committee and find out what was going on there by placing these bugging devices. As you know, within 2 days of that event, Saturday, President Nixon was out in California at the time it happened. Okay? Al Capone was down in Miami on the Valentine's Day massacre, so Nixon wasn't there at the time. Okay? But Nixon came back on Monday, and again, minor story. It was his press secretary, Ron Ziegler, was asked at the morning press conference. They stay at the podium. They did that back then too. It wasn't televised, but same deal, same room. Hey, Ron, what about this burglary that happened at the Democratic National Headquarters a couple nights ago? And Ziegler said it was a 3rd-rate burglary, and it's of no concern to the president. Right? That was in June of 1972. When Watergate broke and some of this started coming out, Ziegler made the famous other comment. He said, this is when Watergate was breaking and the handwriting was on the wall. Ziegler said, all my prior statements are inoperative. That was a phrase there. Yes.
I admit a little bit of naivete on the situation, so I do have a specific question about Ziegler. Did he know at that time when this is a real concern to the president, or was he naive?
He supposedly was naive, as were many people. At that time, it's never been alleged that he was in the loop or knew what was happening, right? And in fact, that's true of a lot of things, and supposedly during his reign there. He was kind of just the face man. Cast of characters, we've seen most of these people. I'm not going to go into much of it. But Donald Segrete is kind of an interesting character. He was the dirty trickster. You might remember him. He was the guy who played a lot of dirty tricks. He forged letters, supposedly by candidates, disparaging certain races and doing all kinds of nasty things to upset the other side. I ended up dealing with him. He was a lawyer. He became a lawyer. He was disbarred for a while and then got his license back. And about 30 years later, he and I were on the same side of a legal case. He was in California. I was practicing here in Minnesota and California. We ended up on the same side of a legal case. It had nothing to do with Watergate. And naturally, when he represented a different party, I represented a different party. We were both on the same side of the case. And naturally, I said, are you the, and he stopped me. He said, I know what you're going to ask. He said, yeah, that was me. Okay? So he was and he's still around practicing law. Mark Felt was the deputy FBI, deputy director of the FBI. He's the one that on that article. He's the one who turned out to be Deep Throat. He wasn't revealed until for 30 years. His revelation came in the early 2003 when he was quite an elderly man. But he was the famous Deep Throat, and hardly anyone guessed who he was. There was a lot of speculation. It's this one, it's that one, but no one, his name didn't materialize, although he was the deputy director of the FBI. He was supposedly upset that he got passed over. J. Edgar Hoover died on May 5th, 1972, 1 month before Watergate. Had Hoover been there, there may have been some differences in how the so-called investigation was handled, but he wasn't, and Felt wanted that position. He didn't get it, so he had somewhat of an axe to grind. Well, that was okay. That was the name that Bob Woodward gave him. Felt would leak information to Bob Woodward. They met in a garage. You may remember that. It's in the movie and the book. They'd meet in a garage. He didn't want to be seen. So Felt would pass on information to Woodward, leads to investigate. He'd say, hey, this is what we're looking at. Here's a possibility. This is going on. That nobody really knew except some insiders of the FBI. And Felt didn't know that much about it either because the FBI was doing, shall we say, a shoddy investigation. But Felt gave Woodward enough leads that Woodward and Bernstein could then start piecing the story together. But Woodward referred to Felt as Deep Throat. He never identified him. Deep Throat, as some of you may remember. Anyone remember who Deep Throat was or what it was? Yes. Brian would know that for sure. What?
It's a pornographic reference, actually.
Yeah. One of the very first porn movies that had any mass circulation was the movie with Deep Throat. It was in the early 70s. It was an X+ rated movie. And now on TV, it'd probably be a GP movie. I don't know, but back then it was pretty salacious. It was called Deep Throat, starring Linda Lovelace. There you go. So he was referred as Deep Throat. Okay, and these are some of the other characters. Okay. But let's talk about the Minnesota connection. Oh, I wondered when you were going to bring that up, Marshall. All right, there were a lot of them. In certain respects, Minnesota was ground zero for Watergate. Or put another way, without Minnesota, Watergate may never have happened, or at least happened the way it came out. Okay? Certainly Washington, D.C. was the ground zero plus, but Minnesota was pretty close up there. How so? Well, the check that went to the Watergate burglars was written by Kenneth Dahlberg. Kenneth Dahlberg was a Minnesota man, a decorated World War II hero. Miracle Ear hearing aids. You bet. That was the first modern hearing aid. Before then, I guess they had tin horns, but now. But he invented and developed Miracle Ear, which still exists under different ownership. But that was Dahlberg's company. He was very, very, very wealthy. Okay? He was a Minnesotan, lived in Wayzata. For a while, the Miracle Ear offices were in Golden Valley, right behind Theodore Wirth Park in that industrial area that's right off of Highway 55. Miracle Ear had some of its offices in that area, right where the Breck Ice Arena is, Anderson Ice Arena on 55. When you go past there, behind there was where Miracle Ear was born and spawned. Okay, there is a road there.
Your computer right on the left.
Dahlberg Drive. Right? That's named for Kenneth Dahlberg. All right, Dahlberg was the Midwest finance chair for CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President. Dahlberg was in charge of raising money in the Midwest for the president's reelection. Right? While after Watergate broke, again, no one was putting it was very hard to put the connections together. There was cover-ups obviously going on, and what started to break the White House connection was the CREEP connection, because the White House and Nixon people were all saying, hey, these are 5 burglars, we don't know anything about it. I don't ever even see these guys. There was James McCord, a former CIA man, who was the security head of the CREEP, and 4 Cubans, as they were called. But everyone said no connection with it was just a third-rate burglary. We don't know why they went in there, but No big deal. The connection to the White House and Nixon began because of Dahlberg's check. He wrote a $25,000 check. It ended up in a Miami bank account of Bernard Barker. Bernard Barker was one of the 4 Cubans in the lead Cuban, who was one of the burglars with the cord. That was Bernard Barker. A bank teller in Miami saw that and contacted Carl Bernstein at the Washington Post because they were the only ones who were writing anything about this at all back then. Nobody cared. Bernstein had written a couple of articles and she saw his name as a byline. She contacted Bernstein and said, gee, this is kind of interesting. There's a $25,000 check. It's going to Bernard Barker and it's coming from the Republican campaign chair in Minnesota. Bernstein flew down there. This is all depicted in the movie. Flew down to Miami, saw the check, made a copy of the check, went back to DC and showed it to Woodward. They went into Ben Bradley and said, hey, you know what? Ben Bradley was the editor of the newspaper. There might be a connection here between what happened a week ago at the Watergate and the White House because the creep money, presidential campaign money, ended up paying the burglars. That didn't break the dam, but it started to open the dam. That was one Minnesota connection. Right after Watergate, John Mitchell, who was the Attorney General, had already left the Attorney General's position and was running the Nixon campaign. CREEP, that was run by John Mitchell, former Attorney General. And Mitchell immediately resigned after the Watergate break-in. He said it was for personal reasons. Indeed, Mitchell knew about the break-in. He was aware of it. He had talked about it with Liddy, so he just got out of Dodge. His replacement was Clark McGregor. Clark McGregor was the 3rd Congressional District representative from Minnesota throughout the 1960s. 3rd Congressional District was this district back then. Now we're in the 5th. But the 3rd Congressional District back then basically covered the western suburbs of Minneapolis, right, Peggy? And it was largely Republican territory too, and had been for many, many years. I think when Dean Phillips won, he was the first Democrat to represent that area in 50 years. But it was a strong Republican area. It was the western suburbs of Minneapolis. McGregor was the congressman from that district, our district back then, throughout the 60s. In 1970, he stepped down from the House and ran against Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey was making a comeback to the Senate. Humphrey, of course, ran for president in 1968. We'll get back to that in a minute. Lost, and he was out of politics for a couple of years. And in 1970, Humphrey ran for the Senate again. Clark McGregor was the one that Nixon picked, sort of, to run against Humphrey because they were very concerned. Hey, Humphrey might run again for president in 72. He didn't succeed. He didn't win. He didn't get the nomination. But they wanted to stifle Humphrey, so they picked McGregor, who had a pretty good background and an impeccable background, and he ran against Humphrey. He lost. Well, they promised McGregor that if he ran against Humphrey and lost, they'd find something for him in the administration. Okay, the deal. Well, they found something for him. They put him as the second in command on the president's re-election campaign. When Mitchell resigned, McGregor took over Mitchell's position. And during the early days of Watergate, he was the spokesperson on Watergate in many respects. Fortunately for him, or unfortunately, he didn't know much about what had happened, and therefore wasn't able to give much information, but he didn't lie about any information. He didn't know anything. The key conspirators weren't telling him anything. So he didn't know much, and because he didn't know much, wasn't able to say much. But he was in charge of that committee after Watergate. And he was one of the few high-level people who was never charged with any crimes, never indicted, and never convicted of any crimes. So he managed to dodge the bullet. Clark McGregor went on to, as a Washington insider for many years, died about 15 years ago, but was a Washington inside lobbyist for many years. Another Minnesota connection was Dwayne Andreas. Dwayne Andreas was a businessman here, locally based. Archer Midland Daniels, big grain company, huge grain company. That was Dwayne Andreas' company. It was spawned and grew up here. He was from this area. He was charged with illegal campaign contributions in one of the Watergate cases. He was tried for making illegal campaign contributions, corporate contributions. What he did, allegedly, not allegedly, it actually happened, is he and his company gave money to their executives, large amounts of money to their executives, and directed their executives to contribute that money to the Nixon campaign. Corporations back then, pre-Citizens United, couldn't contribute to political campaigns. So what Andreas did is he paid his executives money, but basically it was a way of siphoning money from the corporation to the Nixon campaign. He was charged with campaign violations, and he was acquitted in a court trial, not a jury trial. And the basis for the acquittal essentially was that the individuals who had been given this money to pay to the Nixon campaign illegally, their payments weren't illegal. The point is that there was a siphoning off. It was corporate money that went through them. So they wrote the check that the corporation was giving them money. But they were able to show that the executives had paid back the loans, as they called them, to the company, and that acquitted Andreas, at least for criminal purposes. Another Minnesotan who was heavily involved in the campaign financing, fundraising issue was Maurice Stans. Maurice Stans was from Shakopee, Minnesota. He was a businessman. He was the head of the Department of Commerce during the Nixon campaign and Nixon first administration. And during the campaign, CREEP campaign, Stans was the national fundraiser for the campaign. He was one step above Dahlberg. So Stans ran the national fundraising. He's a Minnesotan here from Shakopee. He got himself in trouble because of illegal campaign contributions, illegal fundraising practices, and alleged bribery. He was tried with John Connally, who was the Secretary of Treasury, John Connally, Texas Governor John Connally, Dallas, November 22, 1963, John Connally, Democrat John Connally, who turned into a Republican and was served in the Nixon administration. Stans and Connally were charged with illegal campaign fundraising, but they were acquitted as well. So they were not found criminally guilty. So that's some of the money men involved in Watergate with local links here. A few more Minnesota matters, court cases. I mentioned the Andreas case, the Andreas case, and there was also another case against 3M in 1977. This is, Watergate was pretty much over. The cases from Watergate continued into the early, mid-70s. Watergate, Nixon resigns in 1974. Criminal cases still continued after 74. The big trial with the higher-ups, Mitchell, Hollickman, Ehrlichman, all those folks, that happened in 75 and 76. By 76, the cases were pretty much petering out. But there was one remaining case. The last Watergate case was here in Minnesota. The government, the special prosecutor, sued 3M for making illegal campaign contributions to the Nixon campaign in 1972. The case was thrown out of court because 3M had made campaign contributions to Hubert Humphrey in 1968, and they had been prosecuted back in 68. No one was paying a lot of attention to that because this is pre-Watergate, but they were prosecuted for illegal campaign contributions to Humphrey in 1968. They reached a settlement with the government, and as part of that settlement, the government said they were waiving and releasing and waiving any claims they'd have against 3M for any illegal campaign contributions. It wasn't until Watergate, during the investigation, that it was uncovered that they had made illegal campaign contributions to Nixon as well, and that's what they were charged with. However, 3M came in and said, well, wait a minute, we got a release from the government. The government said, yeah, but we didn't know about these campaign contributions at that time. And the court said, well, it doesn't matter what you knew. Maybe you should have known. But at any rate, since you signed a release, 3M was acquitted of that case too. So the two major money cases, Watergate money cases that took place here in Minnesota, there were several of them, but the two in Minnesota both resulted in acquittals of these rather wealthy individuals and large corporations. So that's, and that was, as I said, the last case. The Watergate Special Prosecutor Office and the whole Watergate legal apparatus shut down after the 3M case. That was the end of Watergate. As I said, Watergate in many ways started with Dahlberg's $25,000 check that ended up in the burglar's bank account, and it ended ignominiously with the acquittal of 3M for illegal campaign contributions. So Minnesota was there at the beginning, the middle, and the end. Got some more things about impeachment, but I won't go into that. A lot of impact of Watergate. What were some of the impacts of Watergate? Well, this is some of them. A lot of statutes. Watergate spawned a lot of statutes, a lot of new laws because of Watergate, and some of these are Minnesota laws. And the article I passed out about whistleblowing talks about that too. Watergate spawned the whistleblowing laws, and these days we hear a lot about whistleblowers. I'm a whistleblower. I complained about this. I got fired for being a whistleblower. The term whistleblowing didn't exist 50 years ago, but whistleblowing came out of Watergate, and after Watergate, 36 states enacted whistleblowing laws. Minnesota was the 37th, kind of late to the bandwagon, but late on the bandwagon, but Minnesota joined it in about 1986. So the whistleblowing law, whenever you hear that term whistleblowers these days, or whenever you hear it, that's a Watergate term that came from Watergate. Minnesota has its own whistleblower law. The Minnesota Data Practices Act, I know Peggy's familiar with that. I mean, all the legislators are familiar with that. That's the statute that sets up that regulates access to government data, public data, private data. When you seek documents from the government, you have to make a request, whether it's public or private, whether you can get the information or not, concerning a wide variety of topics. Oftentimes it deals with discipline of public sector employees, police-related information. Anything that's governmental is subject to what's called the Data Practices Act. Didn't exist before Watergate. It was passed because of Watergate and the concealment that underlied Watergate. So some people refer to it as the Freedom of Information Act. That's the federal law, but the Minnesota law is called the Government Data Practices Act. It's the law that regulates access to and privacy of government information. That's a product of Watergate. Let's see, we talked about the 25th Amendment. Some of you may be familiar with that, but I won't cover that today. And we got some Watergate trivia. Okay, let's play some Watergate trivia here before we wrap it up. All right. What law enforcement agency did G. Gordon Liddy formerly work for? Y'all remember Gordon Liddy? He was the hench person. He devised the Watergate break-in. He wasn't there to break in, but he's the architect of the Watergate break-in. He served the longest amount of time in prison, 4 years, and he was granted clemency by President Carter. He had about 20-year sentence, and Carter gave him clemency after 4 years. Where did he work before? CIA. Close. That was McCord. FBI. He was an FBI agent. That's where they found him. How many years did he spend in prison? I just gave that away. 4 years. John Dean wrote the first book about Watergate. Really? Pardon? Yeah. No, that's not it. That was the second book. No, I wouldn't make it easy. It's called Blind Ambition. And that's the basis of this series that you see. If you see this series on CNN, it's based on Dean's first book called Blind Ambition. Right? What was the name of the Martha? I told you this Martha Mitchell Stars series. It's on Stars, S-T-A-R-Z. That's Gaslit. I mentioned that before. It's really neat. Go watch it. What 2 Academy Award winners starred in the series of Gaslit? Why are you telling that?
What was the deal with Martha Mitchell? Did she get really drunk and start calling up?
Well, she was an alcoholic, but what she did back then, and she was this was again before cable news. If it was cable, she'd have her own show right now. She'd have her own. She'd be a guest. She'd be a host on The View. I mean, but back then again, 3 channels and all that stuff. She knew what was going on a little bit from Mitchell, because her husband Mitchell was right there working the deal. He's the guy who hired Liddy to do the deal. And she would call up the media, the Washington Post, and she'd give them these leaks, but they weren't anonymous like Deep Throat. She was quoted in these, and she kept telling people, the media mainly, and she was on television too, 60 Minutes, she kept saying Nixon knew, Nixon knew, Nixon knew. In part, what she was doing was trying to exonerate to some extent her husband. John Mitchell got a lot of the blame for Watergate, and deservedly so. He was one of the key characters. But she was trying to deflect some of that from him and saying, look, don't blame my husband. That guy in the White House knew, and it really came from those guys in the White House, Nixon, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Dean. But she was talking a lot to the media, and she was blowing the horn, Nixon, 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 White House staff. People weren't listening to her because she had a drinking problem. And in fact, the Nixon White House people did a real campaign, a number on her, saying she's a lunatic, she needs psychiatric care, she's an alcoholic, and she did have drinking problems. So no one paid much attention to her early on. Again, at the end of the day, people look back and said, you know what? She told us a lot of things, and if we would have followed that early on, it might have helped. So that's Martha Mitchell. I'm almost done here. What did a post-Watergate 4-part TV interview? Who did a four-part series with Nixon? Remember that in late 70s?
David Frost.
David Frost. And among many things, Nixon made the statement on there. His 4-part interview was paid out. I think he was paid $100,000, which was a lot of money back then. And Nixon made, Frost, in his 4 days, four parts, Frost asked him, well, you did all these illegal activities. Do you have any remorse? Do you have any apologies for what you did? And Nixon said, when the president does it, it's not illegal. Right? Okay. Who was Nixon's secretary with the 18-minute tape gap?
Rosemary Woods.
Rosemary Wood, not Lincoln, Mrs. Rosemary Wood. There is a Lincoln connection. Rosemary Woods. The significance of that is on June 19th, do I have the dates right? No, June 20th, the Tuesday after the Watergate break-in. Remember, Nixon comes back from California. Haldeman was with him. They have a meeting. Nixon taped all this. We didn't know at the time. Nixon taped his meeting with Haldeman, as he did all the meetings. And they talked about how to, quote, contain Watergate. There's an 18-minute gap on that tape that ultimately was discovered and subpoenaed and all that 2 years later. It took 2 years for that tape to surface. And when that tape surfaced, Nixon was gone or was about to leave. But there's a critical 18-minute gap. I don't know if it's critical. They could have been talking about the weather, but they were talking about the plan on how to cover up Watergate. And in fact, even without that 18-minute tape, what happened is Haldeman sent an emissary over to the CIA and asked the CIA to take the blame and said, look, guys, this was a national security matter. So if you guys will step up to the plate and say that you authorize this as a national security matter, that would be quite helpful. The CIA refused to do that. So Haldeman then went back and said, okay, guys, what's plan 2? And plan 2 was to cover it up some other way. But they had no fall guy, and then they went Mitchell and Dean and all that. But plan 1 was to call this a national security operation through the CIA. What Watergate figure became a post-jail fiction author? Was fairly successful. He was one of the big shots in Watergate. He became a fiction writer and fairly successful. John Ehrlichman, whose daughter went to law school with me while this was all going on. It was not very pretty for her. And who became a minister? There's one Watergate figure became a minister. A couple of them actually did. Charles Colson did, and Jeb Magruder. All right, and there is the denouement. August 9th, Nixon resigns, Ford takes over, and everything turns out the way history has told us it turned out. So that's some of the overview of Watergate with special emphasis on the Minnesota connection. I hope this has been somewhat informative, educative, and I think there's some things that people probably didn't realize so much about Minnesota's significant role at the beginning, middle, and end of Watergate. This is my end. Thank you very much.